All right. Well, welcome to Family Chapel. It's great to be here with you today. Hopefully you are doing well. My name is Josh. I'm one of the pastors here at FC. It's just a privilege to be able to share God's Word with you on this Sunday afternoon. This is a pretty plain observation, a pretty obvious observation maybe even, but we live in a world with much need, right? You look around, you look on the news, you look online, you look at your family, your friends, your neighbors, and it's pretty apparent that we live in a world with much need. And as Christians, hopefully for the most part, we are tenderhearted when it comes to looking at these needs, right? We are filled with Christ's compassion, and we move to meet the needs that surround us, right? We were compelled by the gospel to see someone in need and to do something about that, right? For the most part, hopefully, as Christians, we're pretty tenderhearted when it comes to helping others. But maybe I can ask, are there certain situations where it's not helpful to help others? Are there certain situations where it's actually more harmful to help others? Just for example, like this one time. One day I was kind of just checking on my Gmail, and I got an unexpected email from someone asking for some help. This guy was someone who kind of had lost his finances. He had lost some members of his family, and he was in a really tough situation financially. And so he was reaching out to me to kind of salvage whatever he had left. And he was asking me, Josh, can you just, please help me out here? And I promise, once I'm back on my feet, I promise I'm going to pay you back some way, somehow. Right? So this was kind of the unexpected email that I received one day. I was just kind of checking my email on Gmail. And as I received this email, how did I respond? Right? What was my response to this email that I've received, to this call for help? See, what I did was I took his email and I sent it in the trash folder. I ignored his email. I didn't help him. Why? Because this was a prince from Nigeria asking for my credit card information, right? See, maybe that's happened to you before, maybe not, but in this case, it's pretty clear that I probably shouldn't be helping this guy in the way that he's asking me, right? It's pretty clear that doing so would be more harmful than good. But what about other cases, right? What about that family member who's always asking you for help, but seems to always be finding themselves in trouble after that? What about that friend who's asking you for that favor, but you're not so sure if that favor is a good thing or a bad thing? What about that church member in need of help, and they need you to do something that doesn't seem super clear? How can we help the right people in the right ways? How can we help the hurting without hurting while helping? Or in other words, how can we as a local church, how can we as the people of God, the family of God, how can we support our vulnerable members who are in need? Well, in our passage for today, Paul directs our attention to a very specific group of people in need within this church in Ephesus. He directs our attention to widows. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Josh, I came to church today expecting to hear about widows, right? No one comes expecting to hear about widows. That's one of the joys of preaching through entire books in the Bible. We get to learn about all sorts of different things. Now, I'm aware that we don't have many widows present at Family Chapel. I'm aware that this room is not packed with those that are going through widowhood. But some of you right now are facing this issue, or will at least soon face this issue. As your parents get older, and as one parent passes away before the other. And if we stick around long enough, and hopefully we do, but if we stick around long enough, we'll grow older as a congregation, and we'll find ourselves facing the reality of having widows and widowers in our church. And not just that, right? In our culture, in our current society, with the rising rates of divorce, moms or dads can functionally find themselves as widows or widowers. They can functionally find themselves as raising their families on their own, right? I'm bringing this up because this is not something we can just brush aside and say, you know what, we're young, we're relatively healthy. Right? This passage has no bearing on our lives. Right? We don't need to listen to this sermon. No, there's something valuable here that we need to walk away with in how Paul addresses widows within the church, right? So we're going to be talking about widows today. Well, to understand this passage a little bit better, we have to have a basic understanding of kind of the social reality that surrounded widows back in their time and culture. You see, in the first century, within the Greco-Roman world, women, and I'm not saying that this is right, but this is just the way that it was, women back then obtained their status and their social identity in relation to males. So when you were born, your identity as a woman was based upon your father. And after marriage, your identity, your social status would be tied now to your husband. So here's the thing. If a widow loses her husband, she wasn't just losing a person, but she was also losing her social status. She was also losing her place in society. She was losing her access to the public world. See, back in this culture and time, widows are put in a very difficult situation. They found themselves as very vulnerable members of society who often had very little opportunity to provide for themselves. And so it's with this situation in Ephesus that Paul begins to address the church. He directs our attention to the issue of widows in the church. And he's crystal clear here. He wants us to understand that these widows are not people to push aside. These widows are not people to ignore or brush off as a nuisance or not important. But he's crystal clear here. Rather, the church is called to take care of its vulnerable members. Or in other words, the church is called to help the hurting. The church is called to help the hurting. As the family of God, we are called to take care of one another, especially the most vulnerable among us. See, the strength of a church is not necessarily displayed in how great the sermons are or how many programs we have running or the size of the congregation, but the strength of a church is shown in how well they take care of its weakest members. The strength of a family is displayed in how well we take care of those who are most vulnerable among us. And as the family of God, we are called to help the hurting. So with that in mind, let's take a look at where we see this truth in our passage. We'll be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, starting with verse 3. And it's printed for us in our bulletins as well as it's going to be projected on the screens. But if you have a Bible, I encourage you to turn there with me to 1 Timothy chapter 5, starting with verse 3. And we see this truth here, how the church is called to help the hurting. Paul writes this in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3. He writes, "Honor widows who are truly widows." Right? Honor widows who are truly widows. That is a command. That is not a suggestion. That is not a polite suggestion. That is not a tip. That is not a helpful, thing to say. That is a command. He's saying that widows are not to be neglected. Widows are not to be ignored. They're not to be pushed aside or brushed off as unimportant. He says they are to be cared for. The church is called upon to help the hurting, to meet those in need with a real love, a real care, a real compassion. You see, as the family of God, we are called to care for widows. We're called to share the heart of God. And God's heart is for the widows. We see this time and time again through both the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. For example, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 through 18, God says this. He says, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing." God's heart is for the vulnerable. Isn't that amazing? Right? In God's self-disclosure, in this self-revelation of this is who I am, he ties his mighty hand to his compassionate heart. This God who is God of gods, this God who is Lord of lords, this God who is mighty and awesome is also God of the fatherless, God of the widows, God of the sojourners, God of the vulnerable. Because God's heart is for the vulnerable, God's people should be for the vulnerable as well. But not just that, the gospel compels us to help the hurting. The gospel compels us to move towards those who are in need. It says in James chapter 1, verse 27, James writes, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world." True gospel religion involves taking care of the vulnerable among us. Friends, the church is called to help the hurting, to meet those in need with a real love, a real care, a real compassion. That's the heart of God, and that's the call of the gospel. And here, Paul applies that to how the church is to care for widows. As I was preparing the sermon this week, I had a very interesting week because for the past week, my wife was away for most of the week on a business trip. So from Monday night to Thursday night, she was gone in Arizona to represent Hyundai, and I was home by myself for three days. And while she was gone, this is going to sound a little bit cheesy. I apologize. It's going to sound a little bit cheesy, but I really missed her. I really, really, really missed her. More than I thought I would, right? Maybe that just makes me sound like cold and heartless, but I was really surprised at how much I actually missed her. And I say that because I'm not like one of those like, oh, I missed you so much kind of people. Right? When we were dating for about 6-7 years and we only saw each other about once a week, I was okay with that. I was like, cool, I'll see you 7 days from now. See you later, right? I was surprisingly okay with that, right? I remember when I was, serving and I would see other pastors kind of post on Facebook how much they missed their wives because they were gone at a conference or a retreat for a few days. I'd be like, dude, come on, man, just a few days. Like, why are you complaining? Like, why are you missing your wife? You'll be fine, right? But I get it now. Like, I understand now, right? I understand it's different after you live with someone every single day. It's different after you see someone every single day. Not seeing them is weird. Not being with them is weird. It feels like there is a void missing in my life. Now, that made me wonder how widows and widowers deal with the sudden loneliness they find themselves with when their spouses are suddenly taken from them. That made me wonder. Right? I wonder what it feels like. If I feel this way after only a year of being married, I wonder what it feels like after being with someone for decades, for 30, 40, 50 years, and all of a sudden, they're no longer there. That was a very sobering thought I had as I kind of experienced being by myself for about 3 days. What a sobering thought. And yet, these widows here in Ephesus were going through that. They were facing such a crazy life situation. And yes, while things are better today, thankfully, yes, while there are things like Social Security and Medicare and life insurance and things like that, right, while things are better today, the temptation to ignore the needs of those that are vulnerable are still very great today. In our culture of youth, our culture idolizes youth. In our culture of youth, the elderly are often seen as burdensome. In our culture of individualism, those that are needy are often seen as a drag. In our culture of progress, helping others doesn't seem very productive. But the church is called to help the hurting. The church is called to move towards those who find themselves in vulnerable positions. But not just that. I think this principle of helping the hurting can be broadened out to include not just widows, but others who are vulnerable among us. I don't know if you see this, but within the church, there are huge needs to minister to those with special needs. In our own youth group here at OMC, there are students who are diagnosed and they're on the autism spectrum. And as I look at them and as I look at their parents and their families, I wonder to myself, how can we as a church walk alongside them? How can we as a church love them and support them and care for them well? What do we do once they become old enough and they no longer receive government support? What happens then? Right? Within our own church, there are huge needs to minister to those with special needs. There are huge needs to minister to those that are financially struggling, to minister to those that are facing homelessness, to minister to the elderly in general who find themselves locked away in a convalescent home for much of their lives, to minister to single parents, to minister to the hurting. See, the church is called to help the hurting. As the family of God, we are called to take care of one another, especially the most vulnerable among us. But the question is this: how do we do that well? How do we do this well? Because here's the thing. It is possible to hurt others while trying to help others. It is possible to do much damage while striving to do much good. And that was the issue that this church in Ephesus was facing. Right? It was a complicated, messy situation with the widows, and it's hard to know exactly what's going on here historically in Ephesus. And different scholars, they kind of hypothesize different situations, and just let me geek out for just a minute here, right? But some scholars think that there were just way too many widows. Just the sheer quantity of widows was just draining the resources of the church. Other scholars think that the issue was not so much the sheer quantity of widows, but that some people who are not really widows were posing as widows, and they were taking advantage of the church's resources. Now, other scholars think that there were widows who were signed up to receive support. And as part of them signing up, they had pledged certain things. Things like not getting married again. Things like serving the church in very specific ways. But even though they were signed up to receive the benefits and support from the church, they were neglecting their duties and giving the church a bad reputation. And some scholars think that there were widows who were essentially undercover agents for these false teachers that we've been, talking about for the past few weeks. That they were going around from house to house to house, just spreading their false teachings. Well, whatever the exact historical situation may have been, there was clearly a need to identify which widows the church was to support, right? To wisely identify the hurting. Since the church had limited resources, they needed to discern where that limited support was to go. And so here, Paul gives two qualifications to identify true widows. Two qualifications to identify those who are truly hurting, for identifying the right people to help in the right ways. And these qualifications, they are not rigid checklists, but they are simply guiding principles. And really quickly, the first qualification is that people need to demonstrate real need. If we want to help the right people in the right ways, we need to look for the people who demonstrate real need. Within this church family, we are to help those who have real need. If you take a look at verses 5 and 6, we see this here. Paul writes here, verse 5 and 6, she who is truly a widow, genuinely a widow, she who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead, even while she lives. See, the first qualification is demonstrating real need. Paul writes here that a true widow finds herself left all alone. She has no relatives, no family for support, no source of income, no source of encouragement. And since there is no one to turn to, she has depended on God fully and alone. And she expresses this dependence in her prayer life, praying night and day. This widow, this true widow, has real need. And likewise, we are to assess real need when seeking to help the hurting. And we are to assess the real needs that are out there if we want to really help people. And by assessing real needs, we can better provide right help. And that's because different needs require different help. Right? That's the first qualification. We need to first assess real needs. Now, the second qualification that Paul gives for identifying the right people to give the right help to is that people need to demonstrate not just real need, but also godly character. They need to demonstrate godly character. Within this church family, we are to help those who have shown a godly character. So if you jump down to verses 9 and 10, Paul writes this. He writes, "Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work." Again, not a rigid checklist, but a very broad guiding principles here. And the second qualification that we see is demonstrating godly character. And here, Paul highlights how true widows have lived a full life of faithful service in their marriage as well as in ministry, to those in their own homes as well as to those outside their homes. True widows have shown the right kind of character. And likewise, we are to assess godly character when seeking to help the hurting. And by assessing godly character, we can better provide the right kind of help to the right kind of people. And this is important because by looking for godliness, we can better ensure that the help given will be received well. When godly people who are really in need receive help, instead of receiving that help with ingratitude, they will receive it with thankfulness. Instead of receiving that help with a fear or a shame, they will receive it with a genuine joy. Instead of receiving that help in a way that promotes laziness, they will receive that help in a way that promotes good stewardship. See, when seeking to help the hurting, we need to look for godly character. And these two qualifications, demonstrating real need and demonstrating godly character, these two qualifications are both important as guiding principles because there is a way to hurt those we are trying to help. There is a way to do much damage to those we're trying to do much good. You see, receiving support without demonstrating real need and without demonstrating godly character, receiving that kind of support in that kind of way can breed a sense of entitlement. Right? Receiving support without demonstrating real need or godly character can breed a sense of entitlement. It can lead to having this sense of being owed something, which shows up in ugly ways. And here Paul points out two ugly results of this sense of entitlement, two ugly results of helping the wrong people in the wrong way. And the first thing that we see here is that entitlement leads to ungodly behavior. Entitlement leads to ungodly behavior. Supporting the wrong people in the wrong ways encourages bad behavior. So if you take a look at verses 11 to 13, Paul shows this here. He says, but refuse to enroll younger widows, not just talking about their age, but in contrast to older, godly, truly in need widows. Right? Refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. Now again, it's tough to unpack what exactly is going on here historically, but I think the basic principle is pretty clear here. Supporting those without real needs and supporting those without godly character encourages ungodly behavior. There were some false widows within the church who were doing all sorts of ungodly things. They were running off with strange men. They were neglecting the responsibilities in their own homes. They were denying Christ. They were going from home to home, spreading gossip and lies and stirring up trouble. All in all, their lives were filled with ungodliness. And that's because entitlement can lead to ungodly behavior. Just as an example, when I was in college, I had a church friend, a friend that I grew up with here at OMC, a church friend who had a gambling problem. See, he spent all of his tuition money on gambling. He was addicted, whether it was sports gambling or online gambling or card games. He spent all of his tuition money on gambling. And the problem was that he had lost so much money on gambling that he was in danger of having to drop out of school because he had no more money left to pay tuition. Now, one day, I get a call from this friend, right? I pick up the phone, and he tells me that he needs help. He's asking for some help. And, I made the mistake of giving him some money to time over. Right? He sounded so desperate, he made up some story about the mafia chasing after him to track him down and, hurt him. And I was a pretty naive freshman at the time, and I didn't assess if he had a real need or if he had godly character. And so I just gave him some money. And sure enough, he took the couple $100s that I gave to him, and he spent it all on gambling. See, entitlement leads to ungodly behavior. I actually hurt him by giving him money. He probably would have been much better if I had not given him money in the first place. See, when we don't help the right people in the right way, we actually end up hurting them. We actually push them towards ungodly behavior. That's one ugly outcome. Well, another ugly outcome, number two, that we see here is that entitlement leads or can lead to unfulfilled potential. Not just ungodly behavior, but unfulfilled potential. Supporting the wrong person in the wrong ways can encourage them to actually waste away their lives. Take a look at verses 14 and 15. We see this here. Paul writes, "So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan." So within this historical context, these false widows were running off, they were neglecting their household responsibilities, and in response to that, Paul encourages them to remarry and start families and carry out productive work. He encourages them to pursue honest work, good and noble work. See, he doesn't see them as needy losers who have nothing to offer, but he affirms in them some sense of significance. He affirms that even those who find themselves in difficult situations can make significant contributions to those around them, to the life of the church, to the wider community. See, the goal of helping the hurting is not simply survival. It's not simply so that they can just get by another day. But the ultimate goal of helping the hurting is aimed at helping the other person to thrive. It's recognizing their inherent worth, their inherent dignity. It's recognizing that they are people made in the image of God who have amazing potential to do amazing things for God's glory. It's putting them in a position to succeed, to not waste their lives, but to use their lives well for the sake of God's glory and for the good of others. See, entitlement robs people of that opportunity. It robs people of their dignity. Entitlement robs people of their God-given calling to live lives that are full, to be good stewards of their lives, and to make meaningful contributions. Entitlement pushes people into a mindset that they have nothing to contribute, that they only exist to consume and take from others. So one of the saddest things that we can see is a wasted life. To see people settle for ease rather than strive for what God has called them to do and to be. And in our helping, we have to be careful that we're not contributing to people wasting their lives. And I think we intuitively understand this, right? When we help our kids with their homework, doing their homework for them rather than with them will actually keep them from learning. When we exercise with someone, when we go to the gym with someone, lifting the weights for them rather than with them will not help them to get any stronger. And that same principle applies to helping those who are hurting. We must not rob people of fulfilling the potential, the God-given potential that they have received. We must not be complicit in having people waste away their lives. And so, having seen how we can hurt others while trying to help others, the local church needs to be wise in giving support. See, the danger in helping the wrong people in the wrong way is not primarily because it's going to be a waste of resources. But the real danger in helping the wrong people in the wrong kind of ways is the danger of actually hurting the other person, of actually pushing them towards ungodly behavior or pushing them towards an unfulfilled potential. Therefore, the church needs to exercise wise compassion. We need to help those who are hurting with compassion in one hand and wisdom in the other. This is the role that God has given to the church to navigate well, to help the hurting, yes, but to also help them wisely. Right? This is the role that God has given to the church, but this is not the role of the church alone. In fact, the church is not even to take the primary role in most cases when it comes to helping the hurting. See, the church is to help the hurting in partnership with families. The local church is called to help the hurting, to move towards those who are vulnerable in partnership with families. In other words, helping the hurting begins at home. Helping the hurting begins at home. Here, Paul makes clear that families are to take the initiative in exercising wise compassion towards their members. I know we've jumped around a lot in our passage, but we're going to finish it out with looking at verses 3 to 8. So if you go back to verses 3 to 8, we see here, Paul writes, again, honor widows who are truly widows. Right? That's the command. Church, do this work. But, verse 4, if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Right? This person does not understand the gospel. Helping the hurting begins at home. See, even though Paul sees the church as the family of God, he does not dismiss or disregard the natural family. In fact, in verse 4, he upholds the natural family. And in verse 4, he says that godliness looks like taking care of your family. Godliness looks like taking care of your family members who are in need, and that is pleasing in the sight of God. In other words, we look like Jesus when we are taking care of our family. We have a godliness about us. We have a Christ-likeness about us when we're taking care of our family members. And one of the last things that Jesus says on the cross that we often forget is that he gives instructions to take care of his own mom, Mary. When we think of the last words of Jesus, maybe what comes to mind is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or maybe what comes to mind is, it is finished. And these are like amazing last words. But Jesus also uses his final moments to make sure that his mom, who is a widow, is taken care of even after he is gone. And so while on the cross, Jesus turns to his friend John and he tells him to take care of his mom. Right? Listen to what he says in John chapter 19. He says this, now when Jesus saw his mother, he's hanging on the cross, and when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, John, standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to his disciple John, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his home. Jesus takes care of his mom even at the cross. Even in the midst of such great agony, he turns his attention towards making sure that his mom would be okay. And if you really think about it, Jesus spent far more time being a good son in his home than doing public ministry outside of his home. You see, it is very un-Christ-like to neglect our own families. That's why Paul goes so far as to say in verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith. For a person to claim to be a Christian and that person to deny taking care of their own family members, their claim to faith is rightly questioned. For us, so often we think that the test for godliness, right, the true test for godliness is reading our Bibles and praying and coming to church and singing praise songs and giving our offerings. And yes, those things can be helpful tests for godliness. But a major test that we must not ignore or downplay is how we relate to our own family members, is how we take care of those that are closest to us. See, godliness doesn't just look like reading your Bible or praying or singing praise songs once a week, but godliness looks like being a good son. Godliness looks like being a good daughter. Godliness looks like taking care of our family members. And so the question is this, Christian, do you take care of your family? Christian, are you a good son? Are you a good daughter? Christian, do you take care of your parents? See, many of us will be entering a stage of life in the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years where we will be the primary caretakers of our parents. And some of you in this room right now are already in that stage. You're already playing that role. For those of you that are in that role right now, would you faithfully carry that out, knowing that you are living out the gospel, knowing that you are living out godliness? Press on. I know it's hard. I know it's difficult, but don't lose heart. God will sustain you in this high calling. And for the majority of us who are still a couple of years away, here's the thing. We will not magically love and care and support our families then if we do not start now. We will not magically sacrifice and be there for our parents then if we do not start now. You know, I watched my parents take care of my grandparents toward the end of their lives. I saw my parents make hospital visits. I saw them prepare food. I saw them change their clothes, bathe them, watch them, pray for them, stay up at night with them, pay for medical expenses. And in watching them, I realized, man, those years were very hard. But my parents were able to endure those years and even joyfully go through those years. Why? Because they had spent the previous decades loving and serving my grandparents. See, when my grandparents were sick, they were not strangers who were plopped into my parents' lives, but they were family members who were already a part of their lives. See, helping the hurting starts at home, and helping the hurting starts now. So we've seen today that in partnership with families, the local church should support its hurting members by assessing real needs and assessing godly character. We do not ignore those who are in need, but as we seek to help the hurting, we move towards them with wise compassion. Compassion in one hand and wisdom in the other. We do so because we don't want to hurt while we're trying to help. And as we kind of close out this sermon, I just want to present 2 ways to do that today. 2 ways to help the hurting today, right now, as a church. 2 things. First, as a church, we have something called a benevolence fund here at Family Chapel. And this benevolence fund is a source of financial support to help those who find themselves in tough situations, right? Whether because they lost their jobs, whether because of a health complication or an accident or whatever it might be, the benevolence fund is intended to be kind of a last resort, short-term relief to help this person get back onto their feet. As part of our church's general budget, we've set this aside to meet the needs of those who are struggling. And you can actually contribute directly to that. If your heart is moved to minister to the real needs of people that are struggling in our church family, you can directly contribute into that fund. And we're hoping that this benevolence fund would be a genuine source of support to help the hurting in our church family. That's one thing to consider. The second thing to consider today, right now, is this. As we announced on Facebook this past week, we're hosting a bone marrow registration drive today, right now, right after service. We're going to go out. You're going to see a bunch of people that are taking up registrations for this bone marrow donor registration. And you may have seen on social media, on Facebook or other places, different updates or petitions for these two moms in need of a bone marrow transplant, Julie Jung and Jenny Beagley. They're both in need of these transplants as their last treatment options. And a person's best chance of finding a donor is usually someone of the same or similar ethnic background. And so we are asking those between the ages of 18 to 44 to consider joining this registry, to consider joining the bone marrow donor registry today. Right, representatives from A3M Asians for Miracle Marrow Matches are here today to take registration right after service. And all you need to do is complete a short intake form and give a tissue sample by swabbing your cheeks, and you're it. You're in the system, and if you match, you'll be contacted if you're a match for someone. And we hope that you would prayerfully consider registering today, right after service, to move towards those who are in need in this way. So in light of God's word, I hope that we as a church would seek to help the hurting, that we would move towards those who are vulnerable with compassion as well as wisdom, both in our church family as well as in our own families. You can bow your heads with me as we respond to God's word with a time of prayer. As you think upon all that we've heard today, this afternoon, would you ask God to open your eyes to see the needs that are around you, to see those who are hurting? I think so often we get so caught up with what we need to do with our careers, with our jobs, our schooling, our education, that we have a hard time to see the needs of others. Would you ask God to open your eyes to see those needs? Maybe it's people in this church family, or maybe it's in your own families. Maybe it's your mom, maybe it's your dad, maybe it's a sibling or a cousin, a fellow church member. Maybe it's giving towards the benevolence fund, or maybe it's signing up as a bone marrow donor today. Would you search your heart and ask how God may be calling you to move towards the hurting with compassion and wisdom? Let's spend some time in prayer as we respond to God's word.